A lot of people, when they're at a point in their life where they realize that something's got to change and something's got to improve, they turn to books or the self improvement world more broadly, more and more online these days. And by and large, the books that people turn to are the self improvement, nonfiction, psychology type books. And, this is a great thing to do, especially if you're going from a, doom scroll all day, maybe you smoke weed all day or do something like that. Going from that to reading nonfiction self help books is a night and day improvement. I'm not here to rag on that. But as time's gone on and I've matured and grown as a person, and many others have as well, and they've experienced this too, you start to realize how shallow some nonfiction can be, particularly the, subjectless nonfiction books that kind of have a punchline as a title. This is a very specific type of nonfiction I'm talking about today. And so I wanted to take some time to discuss some ways that we can find better nonfiction, how we can use our time more wisely when we're looking into nonfiction. Very often it's the case that I'll get really interested, get really curious about a topic. I'll buy a book, and 30 to 50 pages in, I'm like, what is this? I actually can't read another 200 pages of this. This is totally not what I thought it was going to be. I think we've made the same point 15 times. That's a very, very common theme with nonfiction nowadays. And so I wanted to go into a couple ways today that I've found are really helpful for me to avoid picking up books like that, because $18 or 15 hours of your life is maybe not too much in the grand scheme right now, but when you look back over your life and realize that you have maybe 150 books that you can read in your life, and you have maybe 30 minutes to an hour a day, depending on your lifestyle, that you have to read, it becomes more and more critical that we are very discriminatory about what we do and don't read. I think that a lot of what is wrong with the nonfiction scene these days is that we've taught that anybody with a following and anybody that has completed a PhD program ought to take the next step and create a passive income stream as an author. And I think that this is a relatively modern phenomenon. If you had to ask me, based on just looking at the publication date of a lot of the books that I have and haven't enjoyed. In the last 10 years especially, a lot of the nonfiction that has topped the bestseller charts, or that you see stacked on the tables at the front of Barnes & Noble, your local bookstore, a lot of these are TED Talks that have been stretched out into 350-page books. And, Bill Gates puts a recommendation on the front cover, and you're sold. This has to be the key to what I'm looking for. And I got to tell you, 9.7 times out of 10, I read 20 pages into these books, whether it's because of a forced workbook club or because I actually thought I would find value there. A lot of the times I read into it and I am nauseous by page 20. And it's not a dig on the authors or even on the subject they're writing about, but I think that the publishing industry, if I had to guess, probably to warrant the input cost of the paper and the printing and the marketing, they probably want at least a X amount of pages in a book, so the authors that have a really good idea that could be distilled into a nice essay or a nice TED Talk, they stretch and beat these dead horses until the MBAs are in tears weeping with how good the books are, but your average person is dozing off by page 40. I think that when we're looking for nonfiction books, one of the things that I've really found is helpful, first and foremost, is look for books that your favorite authors recommend. Now, I'm really on a fiction kick because I think that I've found that there's a lot more truth and humanness in fiction. You can learn 3 nonfiction books worth of lessons from one perfectly executed fiction book by, let's say, Cormac McCarthy or Fyodor Dostoevsky. So what I do is I go and look for the authors, what books did Cormac McCarthy recommend if he was on an interview ever? What books do authors or thinkers that I really look up to, like Nassim Taleb, what books does he recommend? That's a really good one. I mean, there's websites out there with just about any influential person that's, got a reputation, you can find a list of books that they've recommended. I mean, there's one website that I went to, and I've farmed for Nassim Taleb's recommendations because he's a very, fact-based. He will, if you've read any of his books, he will literally call people out by name. So if there was a book that he didn't like, you would know. And if there's a book that he does like, you have to know that there's something in there worth reading. That's kind of my litmus test, or one of my litmus tests. The second one that I would say, and this is hit or miss, but I would say there's a 90% hit right here, is if you're looking for a nonfiction book on a subject, be it history or psychology or anthropology, you're going to want to look greater than 25, 35 years in the past. And I say that with caution because sometimes there's modern evidence that comes to light that kind of invalidates things, but a lot of these books also have a second or third edition that's being printed that will kind of clarify that in the foreword or the afterword. But back then, publishing a book, at least again from an outsider's perspective, seems to have been a very, very experts only type deal. And back then, before like ideology kind of took over a lot of our society, if you were a PhD writing a book on the history of tribes in the Amazon, for example, you really wrote it much more objectively and facts-based than an author would today. They would try and insert things like what role did, like the gender theory and things like that. Like a gender type critique of an Amazonian society from the 80s will look night and day different than one that was written in 2018. And I think that that's an indisputable fact now. So yeah, my second litmus test is to just look for books that are a little bit older, particularly about subjects that are, hard sciences, or subjects that are like history and anthropology, all of the ologies, if you will. And lastly, this is the one that I think takes a lot of discrimination once you're looking at the books themselves, is you need to look for a book that solves a problem or directly addresses a problem you're facing right now. So again, to my example earlier, if you're in a dark place in your life and you're very, not into books at the moment, maybe you do need to read Atomic Habits. I mean, it's not a terrible book. I read it back very, very long ago, and a lot of the things I was already doing, but to someone who's completely disorganized, someone who doesn't have any semblance of a routine in their life, Atomic Habits may actually help you. And I'm not sitting here, ragging on every book ever. If there's a book on investing, or a book on financial literacy, there's a way that these books, even some of these ideas may be pretty surface level to most. If you're at a spot in your life where you willingly accept and know that you're a novice or inexperienced in something, maybe you do need one of those, TED Talks extended into a book. But I would say that a good way that you can vet this, I know there's a lot of, hoodoo about AI right now, but I use AI all the time for book recommendations because in your prompt, you can say, I value factual accuracy and non-polemic, non-fluff books from authors that favor, accuracy over ideology. And I'm looking for blank subject. Give me some recommendations. And it will usually give you some pretty good recommendations. You can go from there and go on YouTube and look. But I look at every minute invested in picking the right book as reaping dividends when you are reading the book itself. I mean, some of the worst books I've ever picked up are honestly books that I went to the bookstore, saw, thought they looked cool, and left with. I mean, when I go to the bookstore, my wife absolutely hates this. But if I see a book that I think I want, I will pull my phone out. I will chat GPT the name of the book and the author and ask, what are their biases? What point of view do they write from? What is the, general reputation in the community, be it the historic or scientific or whatever, of this author, just to make sure that I don't spend my money and my time on something that will either give me a partial or at worst incorrect sentiment of a subject. Yeah, to close up here, I just want to make very clear that I'm not saying that nonfiction books are unnecessary or stupid or, slop for NPCs. Like, that's not at all what I'm saying. But I'm really advocating here because I have done the opposite of it, of being really careful with the nonfiction books that you pick up and really doing your research before you pick it up, to know what it is that you're getting into, because it's your money, it's your time. And again, like I said earlier, you only get, maybe if you have a family and kids and other hobbies and responsibilities, you might have 100 to 150 books that you get to read in your lifetime. And I think that every book of that, population that either leaves you wishing you hadn't read it, or maybe gives you an incorrect idea, or maybe wastes your time. I think that every book like that, it's sad, because that's taking some of your literary life away from you. So I think this is a very important thing to get right. And I wanted to share some of my tips that I found very helpful when it comes to picking the right ones. Thanks for the time today, y'all. Hope y'all are having a great week. It's a rainy one here in North Carolina. Just hurricane season for you. So yeah, leave a comment below. What are some ways that you found to find nonfiction books that are good and not time wasters? What are some ways that you discriminate in the moment between one book versus another? Let me know. I'm always open to hearing more tips. All right. See you guys later.